Lonely rancher found a young native girl collapsed on the roadside. The next day, giant footprints appeared in the cornfield beside it, vanishing suddenly. Thomas McKenna had been riding the same fence line for 12 years when he found her crumpled beside the dirt road like discarded clothing. The morning sky bled crimson across the Montana plains, and something electric charged the air that made his Mara Duchess dance nervously beneath him. At 33, Thomas bore the weathered lines of a man who talked more to cattle than people. His ranch stretched 1,500 acres of solitude, and loneliness had carved hollow spaces in his chest that echoed with every hoofbeat. The isolation felt natural now, comfortable even, until he saw the figure lying motionless against his fence post. She couldn't have been more than 18, with long black hair fanned across the pale dirt like spilled ink. Her brown dress was simple but well-made, intricate beadwork catching the early light along the collar. Even unconscious, her bronze face held a strength that made Thomas suddenly aware of how empty his world had become. He dismounted carefully, boots raising small dust clouds. No visible injuries marked her body, no blood stained her clothes. She simply lay there as if sleep had claimed her mid-stride, her pulse beating weak but steady against his fingertips. Thomas had lived alone since his father died 4 years ago. Making decisions without consultation had become second nature. But staring down at this unconscious stranger, responsibility settled across his shoulders like a heavy coat. He couldn't leave her here. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and Dr. Harrison only made house calls for those who could pay his steep fees. With gentle hands, he lifted her onto Duchess. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp as cloth in his arms. During the 20-minute ride back to his cabin, she never stirred, never showed any sign of consciousness. Her head rested against his chest, and he found himself counting each breath to make sure she was still alive. His cabin sat in an oak clearing, a modest structure built by his grandfather in 1872. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a main room with a stone fireplace that had warmed 3 generations of McKenna men. Thomas carried the girl to his father's old room, laying her carefully on the narrow bed his mother had made up with her own quilts. For the rest of that day, he checked on her every hour. He brought water in a ceramic bowl, dabbed her forehead with a damp cloth, tried to get a few drops past her lips. She remained deeply unconscious, her breathing so quiet he had to lean close to hear it. By evening, worry had settled in his stomach like a stone. Thomas sat in his kitchen as darkness fell, eating beans from a can and wondering what he should do. He knew nothing about caring for sick people, had no experience with unconscious women. His mother had died when he was 15, and since then, his contact with the opposite sex had been limited to awkward conversations with shopkeepers in town. The girl was beautiful, even in her unconscious state. That thought made him uncomfortable, as if he were taking advantage somehow. Should he ride to town for the doctor? But moving her again might make things worse. Should he try to find her family? But he had no idea where she had come from. Sleep came in fragments that night. Every sound made him sit up, listening for signs she had awakened. The wind rattled his windows with unusual force, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled with voices that seemed almost human. When morning finally arrived, Thomas felt as if he had been awake for days. He checked on her first thing, expecting to find her still unconscious. Instead, she was sitting up in bed, dark eyes wide and alert, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. She didn't seem frightened exactly, but wariness marked her posture like a wild animal deciding whether to run or fight. "You're awake," he said, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. She nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes catalogued every detail of the room, noting exits and potential threats with practiced efficiency. When her gaze returned to his face, Thomas felt exposed, as if she could see straight through to his loneliness. "What's your name?" he asked. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, in a voice like wind through grass, she said, "Ayanna, I'm Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch." Another nod. She didn't volunteer information about how she'd come to be unconscious on his road. Didn't ask where she was or how long she'd been there. Her silence felt deliberate, as if words were precious things not to be wasted. Are you hurt? Do you need a doctor? No doctor, she said quickly, the first emotion he'd heard in her voice. Fear, definitely fear. Thomas studied her face, noting how her jaw tightened when he mentioned medical help. Many people in this part of Montana had reasons to avoid official attention. He decided not to press the issue. Are you hungry? I can make breakfast. This time her nod came with what might have been the ghost of a smile. Thomas felt something warm unfold in his chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. When was the last time someone had smiled at him, even tentatively? He prepared eggs and bacon while she remained in the bedroom, emerging only after he called that food was ready. She moved with fluid grace, each step deliberate and nearly silent. At the kitchen table, she ate with focused attention, as if consuming food required all her concentration. Where did you come from? Thomas asked when she'd finished eating. Ayanna looked toward the window, toward the vast expanse of prairie that stretched beyond his property. North, she said simply. How did you end up on my road? Her dark eyes met his for a moment, then looked away. I was walking. Thomas waited for more explanation, but none came. This girl had secrets layered like sediment in her silence. He found himself wanting to know everything about her, wanting to understand the story written in the careful way she held herself. After breakfast, she helped him with dishes without being asked, moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there. Her presence filled spaces Thomas hadn't realized were empty. When she laughed softly at something, the way his cat, Edgar, tried to steal bacon from the pan, the sound hit him like physical warmth. I should probably take you to town, he said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Help you find your family. The laughter died in her eyes immediately. No town, she said, and this time the fear was unmistakable. Thomas set down the dish he'd been drying. Are you running from something? Someone? Ayanna was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. My people don't understand. They think I bring bad medicine. What kind of bad medicine? She looked at him with an expression that seemed much older than her 18 years. The kind that changes things. The kind that makes footprints where no feet have walked. Before Thomas could ask what she meant, she'd moved toward the door. I should go. I've stayed too long already. Wait. The word came out sharper than he intended. She froze, one hand on the door frame. You don't have to go anywhere. You can stay here as long as you need. You don't know what you're offering. Then tell me. For a moment, Thomas thought she might. Her lips parted as if words were gathering there. Explanations that would make sense of her mysterious appearance and strange comments about footprints. But then she shook her head and stepped outside into the morning sun. Thomas followed her, watching as she walked toward his cornfield. She moved between the rows of tall stalks like she was following a map only she could read, stopping occasionally to touch leaves or examine the ground. Purpose directed her movements, but purpose toward something beyond his understanding. What are you looking for? He called. Signs, she said without turning around. Signs of what? This time she did turn, and the expression on her face made his blood chill. Of what follows me. That afternoon, Thomas tried to focus on ranch work, but found himself constantly glancing toward the house where Ayanna sat on his front porch, watching the horizon with intense concentration. She'd braided her long hair and changed into one of his mother's old dresses, which fit her surprisingly well. The transformation made her seem less like a mysterious stranger and more like someone who belonged in his world. But her words echoed in his mind. Bad medicine. Footprints where no feet have walked. What follows me? Thomas had grown up hearing stories from the Crow and Blackfeet tribes who sometimes traded in town. Tales of spirits and magic that his practical father had dismissed as superstition. Now, Watching Ayanna scan the empty prairie with sentinel intensity, those stories felt less like folklore and more like warnings. Evening came with unusual swiftness, shadows lengthening across the land like reaching fingers. Thomas prepared dinner while Ayanna remained on the porch, her stillness so complete she might have been carved from stone. When he called her inside, she came reluctantly, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see something emerging from the gathering darkness. "What are you watching for?" he asked as they sat down to eat. "Things that shouldn't be," she said. "That's not an answer." Ayanna looked at him with those impossibly deep eyes. Some answers are dangerous to speak aloud. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of morning. This silence hummed with tension, with words unspoken and fears unnamed. Thomas found himself studying Ayanna's face in the lamplight, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the way her lashes cast shadows below her eyes. If she was going to leave, and everything about her posture suggested she was, he wanted to remember exactly how she looked in his kitchen, surrounded by the simple warmth of his home. After dinner, she helped him clean again, their movements synchronized as if they'd been doing this dance for years instead of hours. When the last plate was dried and put away, she turned toward the door. "I should go now," she said. "It's dark and cold. Stay tonight, at least." She hesitated, torn between whatever was pulling her away and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "One more night," she agreed finally. "But tomorrow I must leave." That night, Thomas lay in his bed listening to the sounds of someone else in his house. The soft creak of floorboards as she moved around the other room, the whisper of cloth as she settled into bed, even the rhythm of her breathing through the thin walls. For 4 years, these walls had contained only his own sounds, his own solitude. Having another person here felt like discovering a new sense he hadn't known he was missing. He must have dozed because he was awakened by voices. At first, he thought Ayanna was talking in her sleep, but as consciousness sharpened, he realized the voices were coming from outside. Not English, but something melodic and complex that seemed to rise and fall with the wind itself. Thomas slipped from bed and moved to his window. The cornfield spread before him in the moonlight, tall stalks creating deep shadows between the rows. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught his eye. Figures walking between the corn, too tall to be human, moving with fluid grace that made his skin crawl. He blinked hard, certain he was seeing things. But when he looked again, the figures were still there, gliding through his field like they owned it. In the pale moonlight, they seemed almost translucent, more shadow than substance. And they were heading toward his house. Thomas grabbed his rifle from beside the bed and moved quietly toward Ayanna's room. The door was open, the bed empty. Panic shot through him until he saw her standing at the kitchen window, watching the field with the same intense concentration she'd shown all day. "What are those things?" he whispered. She didn't turn around. "My family." "Your family?" "Some of them. The ones who want me to come home." Thomas joined her at the window, his rifle forgotten in his hands. The figures had stopped at the edge of his property, just beyond the fence line. In the moonlight, he could see they were tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. Their faces were shadows within shadows, but he could feel their attention like weight pressing against the glass. "They're not human," he said, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. "No," Ayanna agreed. "Not entirely. And you are?" She turned to look at him then, and in the moonlight, her eyes seemed to hold depths that went on forever. "Not entirely." The figures outside began to move again, circling his house with patient precision. Their voices rose and fell in that strange, musical language, and Thomas realized they were calling to Ayanna, not demanding exactly, but requesting, pleading, even. "What did they want?" he asked. "For me to stop running." "To accept what I am. And what are you?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time, watching her family circle his home like wolves around a campfire. When she finally spoke, Her voice was heavy with something that might have been grief, something that shouldn't exist. Child of two worlds that were never meant to touch. The circling stopped. The voices fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, the ticking of his father's old clock, the soft whisper of wind through corn stalks. Then, as abruptly as they'd appeared, the figures melted back into the shadows. Within moments, the field looked empty and normal, as if nothing had ever been there at all. "They're gone," Thomas said. "For now, but they'll return tomorrow night. And the night after that. They'll keep returning until I go with them." "Where would they take you?" "Home. To the place between places where people like me belong." Thomas set his rifle against the wall and turned to face her fully. In the kitchen's dim light, she looked fragile and impossibly young, but her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "What if you don't want to go?" "It doesn't matter what I want. I'm dangerous here. My presence brings things that should stay hidden into your world. Things like your family, among others." Thomas thought about the strange feeling he'd experienced that morning, the electric charge in the air, and Duchess's nervous behavior. "Is that why you were unconscious on my road? Because you were running from them?" Ayanna nodded. "I used too much energy trying to hide. My body couldn't sustain it. And now? Now I'm rested. I can run again. Or you could stay." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Thomas had lived alone for so long that solitude felt like his natural state. But something about Ayanna's presence in his house, her quiet help with daily tasks, the way she'd laughed at his cat's antics, it all felt right in a way he hadn't expected. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said. "Then explain it to me." Ayanna moved away from the window, pacing his small kitchen like a caged animal. "I'm not fully human, Thomas. My mother was Crow, but my father was something else. Something that lives in the spaces between your world and mine. I inherit abilities from both sides, but I belong fully to neither." "What kind of abilities?" She gestured toward the window, toward the field where her family had appeared. "I can call things that shouldn't be called. I can open doors that should stay closed. When I'm emotional, when I'm scared or angry or happy, things happen around me. Footprints appear where nothing has walked. Shadows move without light to cast them. Animals behave strangely." Thomas thought about Duchess's nervous behavior, about the electric feeling in the air. "Is that why your people think you bring bad medicine?" "My mother's people, yes. They see the strangeness and fear it. My father's people want me to embrace it fully, to leave the human world behind." "And what do you want?" For the first time since he'd found her, Ayanna looked vulnerable. The strength in her face cracked just enough to let him see the frightened girl underneath. "I want to belong somewhere," she whispered. Thomas crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in his. They were cold despite the warm night, and he could feel her trembling. "You belong here," he said. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I know that my house has felt more like a home today than it has in 4 years. I know that you fit into my life like you were always supposed to be part of it. I know that whatever you are, whatever abilities you have, they don't scare me." Tears gathered in Ayanna's eyes, catching the moonlight like trapped stars. "They'll keep coming for me. My father's people won't give up. Then we'll deal with them when they come. And if I lose control? If my emotions call something dangerous into your world?" Thomas squeezed her hands gently. "Then we'll deal with that too." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of doubt or fear. He tried to project confidence he wasn't entirely sure he felt, but beneath the uncertainty was something solid and unshakable. He didn't want her to leave. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know?" Thomas had been asking himself the same question since the moment he saw her lying beside his fence. The answer wasn't logical or practical, went against every instinct for self-preservation his father had tried to instill in him. "Because I've been alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to have someone to care about," he said. "Because you make my house feel alive in ways I didn't know it was dead. because when you smiled at breakfast this morning, it was the first time in years that I remembered what happiness felt like." The tears spilled over then, tracking silver paths down her cheeks. Thomas reached up to brush them away, marveling at the softness of her skin. "I could hurt you," she whispered. "You could. But loneliness was already killing me slowly. At least this way, I choose my risk." Ayanna leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as if his hand against her cheek was the first comfort she'd felt in a very long time. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. The walls she'd built around herself hadn't crumbled entirely, but cracks had appeared in their foundation. "If I stay," she said, "things will happen. Strange things. My emotions aren't always under my control. I lived through my father's death and 4 years of complete isolation. I think I can handle strange." She almost smiled at that. "You may change your mind. Then I'll change it back." This time she did smile, and Thomas felt that same warm unfurling in his chest he'd experienced at breakfast. But this smile was different, less guarded, more genuine. It transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with the arrangement of her features and everything to do with the light that seemed to emanate from within. The next day passed with the strange intensity of time before a storm. Thomas went through his normal ranch duties, but everything felt heightened, more significant. He was hyper-aware of Ayanna's presence as she moved around his house, helping with small tasks and watching the horizon with increasing tension. As evening approached, Ayanna grew increasingly restless. She paced the length of his front porch, stopping frequently to scan the empty prairie. Her family would come with the darkness, Thomas knew, and this time they wouldn't be content to simply circle his house. "What will they want?" he asked as they ate dinner. "To take me home. To the place between worlds where I can do no harm to either realm. And if you refuse?" Ayanna met his eyes across the table. "They won't accept refusal easily. My father's people don't understand human attachment. They'll see you as an obstacle to be removed." Thomas nodded, having suspected as much. "What are they capable of?" "They can manipulate reality in small ways. Make you see things that aren't there, hear voices that speak lies. They can make the ground beneath your feet feel like water, make fire burn cold and ice burn hot. But they can be fought with difficulty. They're not entirely physical, so bullets and blades have limited effect. But they can be hurt, and they can be driven away if you know how. Do you know how?" Ayanna was quiet for a moment, pushing food around on her plate. "There are ways. But they require me to use my abilities fully, and when I do that ... things come through. Yes." Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Then we'll be ready for whatever comes through." As full darkness settled over the ranch, Thomas and Ayanna prepared for the confrontation they both knew was coming. He loaded his rifle and checked his revolver, though he wasn't sure how much good conventional weapons would do against otherworldly beings. Ayanna moved through his house, touching various objects, door frames, windowsills, the stones of his fireplace, murmuring words in that musical language he was beginning to recognize as something older than human speech. "What are you doing?" he asked, warding. "Creating barriers that will slow them down, make it harder for them to enter your house uninvited. Will it work?" "For a while. But if they're determined, they'll find a way through eventually." They didn't have to wait long. As the moon reached its zenith, the voices began again. This time they were closer, circling the house with deliberate intent. Thomas peered through his kitchen window and saw them. Dozens of tall, ethereal figures moving through his yard like smoke given form. "They've brought reinforcements," Ayanna said quietly. The figures stopped their circling and arranged themselves in a rough semicircle facing the front of the house. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, with features that seemed to shift and blur in the moonlight. When it spoke, its voice carried easily through the walls, resonating in Thomas's chest like the lowest notes of an organ. Child of two bloods, it said, the words strangely accented but clearly understandable. You have run far enough. It is time to come home. Ayanna moved to the window, her hands pressed against the glass. I am home, father. The figure Thomas now realized was her father tilted its head. This is not home. This is exile. This is diminishment. You belong with your people, in the realm where your true nature can flourish. My true nature is both human and other. I won't abandon half of what I am. The human half brings you only pain. Look how your mother's people cast you out. Look how you flee in fear of your own power. Come with us and know peace. Thomas stepped up beside Ayanna, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. The gesture wasn't lost on her father, whose shifting features seemed to focus more intently on the house. And what of this one? The otherworldly being asked. This brief mortal who thinks to claim what belongs to the eternal realm? He doesn't claim me, Ayanna said firmly. He offers me choice, something your people have never done. Her father's laugh was like wind through dry leaves. Choice is illusion. You are what you are, child. You cannot change your nature by denying it. She doesn't have to change her nature, Thomas said, surprising himself by speaking aloud. She just has to learn to live with it. The father's attention turned fully to him then, and Thomas felt the weight of that otherworldly gaze like pressure against his skull. You speak of things beyond your understanding, mortal. Do you know what she is capable of when her emotions run wild? Do you know what follows in her wake? I'm learning, Thomas said steadily, and I'm not afraid. Then you are a fool. The temperature around the house began to drop noticeably. Frost formed on the windows despite the warm night, and Thomas's breath began to mist in the air. Outside, the other figures began to move again, but this time they weren't circling. They were closing in. Last chance, daughter, her father said. Come willingly, and this mortal will be unharmed. Refuse, and we will take you regardless. Ayanna's hand found Thomas's and gripped it tightly. I refuse. The attack came without warning. The figures rushed the house from all sides, passing through walls like they were made of mist. Thomas's rifle was useless. The bullets passed harmlessly through their ethereal forms. But they were solid enough to grab Ayanna, solid enough to begin dragging her toward the door. She fought back with abilities Thomas had only glimpsed before. Light blazed from her hands, and the air around her shimmered with heat that made the attacking figures recoil. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming despite her resistance. Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed Ayanna around the waist and held on, refusing to let them take her even as otherworldly hands tried to pry his fingers loose. The touch burned like ice, but he didn't let go. You're making this harder than it needs to be, her father said, his voice now coming from directly behind Thomas. Release her and live. Hold on and burn. Not a chance, Thomas gritted out through clenched teeth. That's when Ayanna made her choice. Instead of fighting against her captors, she stopped resisting entirely, but she didn't surrender. Instead, she opened herself completely to the otherworldly power flowing through her veins. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Light exploded from Ayanna's body, driving back the figures trying to drag her away, but it didn't stop there. The light kept growing, kept expanding, until it filled Thomas's entire house and spilled out into the night beyond. And with the light came other things. The air in the kitchen tore open like fabric, revealing glimpses of other places, other worlds. Through the tears came creatures that made Ayanna's family look positively mundane. Things with too many teeth and not enough substance. Beings of pure hunger and endless void. But Ayanna wasn't finished. With careful precision born of years of suppressed power, she began to direct the chaos she'd unleashed. The otherworldly predators that came through her portals ignored Thomas entirely, focusing instead on the ethereal figures trying to take her away. Her father's people were powerful, but they weren't prepared for this level of assault. The creatures Ayanna had called were older, hungrier, and completely without mercy. Within minutes, Most of her family's reinforcements had fled back to whatever realm they'd come from. Only her father remained, his shifting form now more solid, more defined. The otherworldly predators seemed to recognize him as something beyond their ability to harm, circling him warily but not attacking. "Clever, daughter," he said, and there was something like pride in his voice. "But you cannot maintain this level of power indefinitely. And when you falter, these creatures will turn on your precious mortal." He was right. Thomas could see the strain on Ayana's face, could feel her beginning to tremble with exhaustion. The light blazing from her skin was flickering, and the tears in reality were starting to close. "Send them back," her father commanded. "Come with me willingly, and I'll ensure they don't devour everything in this realm before departing." For a moment, Thomas thought she might do it. The temptation to end the danger, to protect him and everyone else in the surrounding area, was written clearly on her face. But then her jaw set with determination he'd seen before. "No," she said simply. Instead of sending the creatures away, she did something Thomas hadn't expected. She spoke to them in their own language, a series of clicks and hisses that made his teeth ache, and they listened. The otherworldly predators arranged themselves in a defensive circle around Thomas and Ayana, their attention focused outward toward her father. It was clear they were following her commands now, bound by some agreement Thomas couldn't fathom. Her father's expression shifted through several emotions Thomas couldn't name before settling on something that might have been resignation. "You would bind yourself to such creatures? Trade one form of exile for another?" "I'm not binding myself to anything," Ayana said, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious exhaustion. "I'm making alliances, learning to work with my nature instead of against it. And when these alliances demand prices you cannot pay, then I'll find another way. That's what humans do, they adapt." For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other across the chaos-filled kitchen. Then, slowly, her father began to fade. "You have chosen your path," he said as his form became translucent. "But know that it leads to places even I cannot follow. When the time comes that you need our help, it may no longer be available." "I understand," Ayana said quietly. "Do you? We shall see." With that, he was gone, leaving only the scent of ozone and the memory of otherworldly presence. The creatures Ayana had summoned lingered for a few moments longer, their alien attention fixed on Thomas with what might have been curiosity. Then they too began to fade, slipping back through the tears in reality that were slowly closing. Within minutes, Thomas's kitchen looked normal again. If not for the lingering cold and the faint scorch marks on his walls, he might have thought the entire confrontation was a dream. Ayana collapsed into one of his chairs, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with something that might have been triumph. "Is it over?" Thomas asked. "This part is. They won't come back, at least not like this. My father's people respect strength, and I've proven I'm strong enough to make my own choices." "And those other creatures? The ones you made alliances with?" Ayana smiled, and it was only slightly unsettling. "They're bound to leave your realm alone as long as I keep my part of our bargain, which is? I help them deal with problems in their own realm from time to time. Nothing that will hurt innocent people, just cleaning up messes that need supernatural attention." Thomas sat down across from her, his rifle finally forgotten on the floor. "So you're staying, if you'll have me. I know this wasn't what you bargained for when you found me on your road." Thomas looked around his kitchen, taking in the scorch marks and the lingering scent of otherworldly power. His quiet, isolated life was gone forever. In its place was something uncertain, probably dangerous, definitely complicated. He'd never been happier about anything in his life. "I'll have you," he said simply. 3 months later, Thomas woke to the sound of Ayana humming in his kitchen, preparing breakfast while Edgar the cat wound around her ankles hopefully. Footprints appeared in his cornfield regularly now, but they were usually from creatures coming to consult with his wife about problems in their own realms. She'd developed quite a reputation as someone who could broker peace between different supernatural factions. The isolation Thomas had once cherished was gone, replaced by a steady stream of otherworldly visitors and the constant underlying hum of power that surrounded Ayanna like a second skin. But his house had never felt more like home. He'd chosen his risk, and she'd chosen to stay. Everything else they figured out together.